Cyprus, an island of sun-drenched hills and ancient olive groves, has always been more than a picturesque Mediterranean outpost. For millennia, it has been a coveted prize for empires, a pivot between East and West, a gatekeeper to the rich lands of the Levant, and a crucial node for the Mediterranean's sea lanes. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire's centuries-long hold on Cyprus had ended, and the British had stepped into the breach in 1878, promising stability and protection while quietly consolidating strategic advantage. The island, small yet fiercely symbolic, became an imperial jewel not for its size, but for its position. It was during the Second World War, however, that Cyprus's strategic importance truly crystallized. Britain, stretched thin across multiple continents and theaters of war, needed secure points to project power into North Africa and the Middle East. Cyprus, with its proximity to Egypt and the Suez Canal, became a linchpin for controlling oil routes and naval passages essential to the Allied war effort. British troops fortified the island, airfields were constructed, and radar stations began to dot the coast. Yet the colonial administration faced a precarious balancing act. How could Britain secure this vital military foothold without inflaming the local population, whose allegiances were divided and whose patience was already fraying? Greek Cypriots, who formed a majority population, harbored a simmering desire for an union with Greece. This dream had deep cultural, religious, and historical roots, stretching back decades and even centuries of Hellenic identity on the island. To them, British occupation was merely a temporary obstacle to a larger destiny. But Britain was in no mood to negotiate sovereignty during a global war, and they dismissed petitions and public appeals with bureaucratic coldness. The seeds of conflict, subtle but persistent, were already being planted. It seemed an ordinary wartime colony, yet beneath the veneer of calm, the island was quietly brimming with tensions that would explode in the years to come. Some British officials were unaware or chose to ignore the fragile nature of these loyalties. Reports from the early 1940s indicated that Greek Cypriot youth were increasingly joining nationalist clubs and clandestine societies, studying the history of the Greek War of Independence and dreaming of joining the Hellenic state. Meanwhile, the Turkish Cypriot minority, historically smaller but significant, watched these developments with alarm, worrying about what Greek unification would mean for their own security and identity. The stage was being set for a political and ethnic fault line, though at this point, it was invisible to most observers outside Cyprus. Despite the global chaos, local governance continued, and Cyprus became a critical logistical hub. British air squadrons used the island to launch reconnaissance missions into the Aegean, while naval patrols monitored Axis movements in the eastern Mediterranean. Yet these military successes could not mask the underlying discontent. Every patrol, every fortification, every march of soldiers reminded the population that the island was under foreign rule, and that their own aspirations were being sidelined. The British strategy of infrastructure and force maintained order on the surface but deepened resentment in private homes, coffee shops, and churches, where whispers of resistance circulated. The war itself brought immediate challenges. In 1941, Cyprus narrowly avoided Italian aerial attacks, launched from nearby islands under Axis control. Supply lines were strained, and the British garrison faced logistical nightmares. Food shortages, rationing, and the constant hum of wartime anxiety added fuel to the fire of local dissatisfaction. Greek Cypriots resented the British military presence. Turkish Cypriots resented the rising assertiveness of their Greek neighbors. Both communities were observing each other with suspicion, setting the stage for future conflict. Meanwhile, political activists in the Greek Cypriot community quietly prepared for a new phase. Discussions about post-war Cyprus were already underway, even as Europe burned. Leaders debated strategies to press for union with Greece once the war ended. Knowing that British priorities would eventually shift back to civil governance and away from military they organized petitions, letters, and delegations to London, often ignored or dismissed, building frustration into a simmering determination that would eventually become something far more explosive. The stakes were clear. The war was not just about Europe or North Africa. It was also about what kind of future Cyprus would have once the guns fell silent. Could the island remain a loyal British outpost, or would the centuries-old dream of Enosis finally ignite into action? And as these questions loomed, whispers in the hills spoke of clandestine meetings, secret plans, and young men ready to take matters into their own hands, risking life and limb to achieve a dream that seemed increasingly within reach, but fraught with danger. If you're following this story, please take a moment to click the subscribe button and like this video. It helps more people discover the history of Cyprus and the untold stories of its struggles and divisions. Because the truth about Cyprus is more than political personnel. It's human, and it's about the choices people make when empire and aspiration collide. By the end of the war, Cyprus had emerged as both a critical strategic base for the Allies and a simmering tinderbox of ethnic and nationalist ambitions. The British had succeeded militarily, but had done little to resolve the political and social tensions on the island. Greek Cypriot nationalists were emboldened, Turkish Cypriots were alarmed, and the colonial administration had inadvertently planted the seeds for decades of unrest. The island's next chapter would not be written in military dispatches, but in the streets, villages, and secret meetings of Cypriots and era that would transform the island forever. The question hanging in the air was one of destiny. When the war ended and the world tried to return to normal, would Cyprus reconcile its diverse communities under a single banner? Or would the clash of ambition, identity, and colonial legacy push the island to a point of no return? And in the shadows of this question, secret plans were already taking shape. Plans that would change the island's course and set it on a path to division. The guns of the Second World War may have raged across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. But on Cyprus, a different kind of battle was quietly unfolding, one of identity, ambition, and the unyielding desire for self. While Britain poured resources into defending the Mediterranean against Axis threats, Greek Cypriots nurtured a dream that had been simmering for decades. Enosis, the union of Cyprus with Greece. This dream was not a fleeting whim. It was a deeply rooted aspiration, passed down through generations, entwined with faith, language, and culture. At first, these ambitions expressed themselves through peaceful, political channels. Petitions were sent to London, public rallies celebrated Greek history, and intellectuals wrote essays articulating a vision for a united Hellenic Cyprus. But as the war dragged on and the British administration continued to prioritize military strategy over local political concerns, frustration grew. For every petition ignored, for every peaceful appeal dismissed, the Greek Cypriot majority felt increasingly marginalized in the land they called home. This mounting frustration did not go unnoticed. Secret circles of young nationalists began forming in towns and villages across the island. They were inspired not only by the Greek War of Independence, but also by contemporary anti-colonial movements across the globe. They studied the successes and failures of insurgent groups, learning how small but determined factions could challenge imperial powers. By the mid-1940s, whispers of organized resistance began to circulate in the hills and backrooms of Nicosia, Larnaca, and Famagusta. It was not just ideology that fueled this movement. It was a sense of urgency. Observers outside Cyprus could see the war's outcome reshaping Europe, and Greek Cypriots feared that if they did not act soon, the opportunity to achieve enosis might slip away. Political maneuvering alone would not suffice. Small clandestine cells were established, training young men in secrecy, stockpiling weapons, and planning ways to make their voices heard by the world. And yet, none could predict the scale and intensity of the conflict that would soon engulf the island. Even as this quiet preparation took root, tensions between Greek and Turkish Cypriots began to rise. Turkish Cypriots, aware of the growing enosis sentiment, feared that their own identity and security were at risk in a unified Greek Cyprus. Meetings were held in village halls, mosques, and private homes to discuss protective measures, signaling the early emergence of a Turkish Cypriot resistance mindset. The seeds of division, Togsato, were beginning to take hold. The island, which had long been a mosaic of coexisting communities, was starting to fracture along ethnic lines. As the world celebrated the Allied victory in 1945, Cyprus faced a different reality. The end of the war brought not peace, but a return to political grievances and unfulfilled promises. Greek Cypriot leaders pressed the British for negotiations, but the colonial administration, wary of the rising tide of nationalism, remained steadfastly inflexible. This refusal to engage in meaningful dialogue created fertile ground for The stage was set for EOKA, guerrilla organization that would change the island forever. EOKA, or the National Organization of Cypriot Fighters, emerged in the early 1950s with a clear goal: to end British rule and achieve enosis through armed struggle if necessary. Their methods were controversial, but strategically calculated, sabotage, bombings, and targeted attacks against colonial institutions. For the British, the sudden eruption of violence was shocking. But for Greek Cypriot nationalists, it was the inevitable next step in a struggle that had been decades in the making. The narrative of peaceful petitions had shifted to one of insurgency, marking a pivotal transformation in Cyprus's political landscape. The British, veterans of colonial conflicts elsewhere, responded with a mix of force and intelligence operations. Curfews, mass arrests, and collective punishments became commonplace. But the more the administration tried to suppress the insurgency, the stronger its resolve became. Public sympathy in the Greek Cypriot community increasingly aligned with EOKA fighters, who were viewed not as criminals but as patriots risking everything for their homeland. Meanwhile, the Turkish Cypriot minority was pulled deeper into the orbit of these tensions. Initially neutral observers, many began forming their own organizations to counterbalance Greek Cypriot activism, laying the groundwork for a TMT, Turkish Resistance Organization. The British, recognizing the growing divide, unintentionally or perhaps deliberately used these divisions to maintain control, employing a divide-and-rule strategy that would have long-term consequences. This was no longer a struggle confined to political halls or clandestine meetings. Villages began to polarize, social relations strained, and a sense of inevitable conflict permeated the air. The idyllic Mediterranean island, with its history of shared marketplaces, festivals, and church-mosque coexistence, was becoming a powder keg. And as tensions escalated, plans were quietly made in secret rooms, in safe houses, and in the hillsides, plans that would ignite a confrontation with consequences far beyond the British colonial administration's control. Young Greek Cypriots trained in guerrilla tactics waited for the signal. Families feared reprisals, but passion and nationalism outweighed caution. The island teetered on the brink of violent upheaval, and as the British fortified towns and villages, they unknowingly walked into a struggle that would test their ability to govern an increasingly divided population. The calm surface of post-war Cyprus was a deceptive veneer, hiding a storm of rebellion, mistrust, and the first sparks of what would become a decades-long division. By the early 1950s, the island was set. EOKA was ready to strike. The Turkish Cypriots were preparing to defend their communities, and the British administration faced a complex, multifaceted challenge unlike any other in the empire. What had begun as political aspiration was about to erupt into a violent struggle that would scar Cyprus for generations, and the world would watch as this seemingly small island became the focal point of a battle between nationalism, identity, and colonial authority. The question now loomed: when the EOKA finally initiated their insurgency, how would ordinary Cypriots respond? And more importantly, could the British maintain control over an island now divided not just by allegiance to empire, but by ethnic and nationalist lines that had deepened over decades? The answers would reshape Cyprus forever. By 1955, the simmering tensions that had quietly defined Cyprus for decades erupted into open conflict. The streets of Nicosia, Larnaca, and Famagusta, once bustling with ordinary commerce and everyday chatter, were suddenly punctuated by the thunder of explosives, the sound of gunfire, and the fear of impending violence. EOKA, the National Organization of Cypriot Fighters, had launched its campaign. Its mission was clear: drive the British colonial administration from the island and achieve enosis, the union with Greece. But what began as a nationalist struggle would quickly evolve into a full-blown insurgency that would engulf every aspect of life in Cyprus. On the night of April 1st, 1955, the first major attacks shocked both the British authorities and the local population. Police stations, infrastructure targets, and military installations were struck simultaneously across multiple towns. The strategy was calculated to demonstrate that the British, despite their military strength, were vulnerable to a determined and organized insurgency. For Greek Cypriot fighters, it was a declaration that political appeals were no longer sufficient. Action, even at great personal risk, was the only path forward. The British, seasoned from colonial conflicts in Malaya and Kenya, responded swiftly and ruthlessly. Curfews were imposed, mass arrests carried out, and military patrols dominated once quiet villages. In the midst of this chaos, two figures emerged as central to the Greek Cypriot cause. Archbishop Makarios, the spiritual leader, sought to channel nationalist sentiment into diplomatic and political leverage, advocating for enosis, while condemning unnecessary violence. In contrast, George Grievous, a former Greek army officer and the military strategist of EOKA, believed that only armed struggle could achieve freedom. Their collaboration was complex. One provided moral legitimacy, the other provided the operational know-how. Yet even as they coordinated, the conflict began to take on a life of its own, spiraling beyond the control of any single leader. The British response was both immediate and harsh. In addition to curfews and arrests, the colonial administration employed tactics designed to disrupt guerrilla operations. House-to-house searches, roadblocks, and restrictions on movement became routine. Intelligence networks were expanded, and interrogation techniques, often brutal, were used to extract information about EOKA cells. But the harder the British pushed, the more entrenched the insurgency became. Each act of repression fueled resentment, transforming ordinary citizens into sympathizers and even supporters of the guerrilla fighters. Villages that had once been neutral began harboring fighters in secret, hiding weapons, caches in olive groves, and abandoned barns. As the violence escalated, the psychological impact on the population was profound. Families lived in fear that a single knock at the door could bring arrest, or worse. Civilians were caught in the crossfire of a struggle that was both nationalistic and existential. Turkish Cypriots, who had initially observed the conflict from a cautious distance, now faced growing uncertainty. In some areas, attacks by Greek Cypriot insurgents inadvertently targeted Turkish Cypriot neighborhoods, intensifying fear and mistrust. It was the beginning of a transformation from anti-colonial insurgency to intercommunal conflict, setting the stage for decades of division. Amid this turmoil, international attention began to focus on Cyprus. Reports of violence, imprisonment, and torture reached the global press, prompting debates in London, Athens, and Ankara. The world watched an island that, on the map, seemed small and peripheral, yet represented critical questions about decolonization, nationalism, and ethnic identity. Britain's global image was at stake, but so too were the aspirations of a population determined to assert its cultural and political identity. EOKA's tactics were sophisticated. Sabotage operations, disrupted infrastructure, cut communications, and targeted economic symbols of British power. Ambushes were carried out on convoys, and even high-profile assassinations of collaborators were undertaken. Each strike was meticulously planned, and each British countermeasure only served to strengthen EOKA's narrative of righteous resistance. The island was locked in a cycle of attack and reprisal, leaving no room for ordinary life to continue unchanged. The British administration, desperate to regain control, eventually resorted to declaring a state of emergency. This granted security forces extraordinary powers, dissension without trial, curfews, and the deployment of additional military units. Villages were fortified, and surveillance intensified. Yet, despite these overwhelming measures, EOKA continued to operate with increasing audacity. Their resolve fueled by nationalist fervor and community support. The struggle became emblematic of the limits of colonial authority when faced with a population united in purpose and identity. As EOKA escalated its insurgency, the British realized the potential to exploit divisions within the island. They began reaching out to the Turkish Cypriot minority, fostering local defense groups to counterbalance Greek Cypriot militancy. This divide-and-rule approach had immediate tactical advantages, but it also sowed the seeds for a lasting fracture. Communities that had coexisted for centuries were suddenly divided by suspicion and competing loyalties. Schools, marketplaces, and religious institutions began to reflect this growing polarization. What began as a struggle against a colonial power was now evolving into a bitter intercommunal conflict that would shape Cyprus for generations. The stakes were not only military but profoundly human. Ordinary Cypriots, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers were caught in a storm they did not choose. Villages were burned, homes raided, and civilians were often treated as enemies by both sides. The island's social fabric began to tear, with lines of trust and cooperation replaced by fear and secrecy. Every decision, every act of violence, carried the weight of potential retaliation. And yet, the insurgency pressed on, carried by young men and women willing to risk everything for their vision of the island's future. Please click the subscribe button and like this video. If you're following this story, it ensures more people can learn about the intense struggle and the human drama behind Cyprus's division. The bravery, fear, and heartbreak of these events are not just history, they are lessons in the costs of colonial ambition and the resilience of those who fight for identity and self-determination. By the late 1950s, the conflict had transformed Cyprus. EOKA's insurgency had challenged the might of the British Empire, forced international attention, and laid the groundwork for the eventual political and ethnic division of the island. The British had maintained nominal control, but at the expense of deepening mistrust between Greek and Turkish Cypriot. What had begun as a nationalist struggle against colonial authority now contained the seeds of permanent intercommunal division, a division that would erupt violently in the years to come and leave Cyprus fractured for decades. The looming question was clear. With the island consumed by insurgency, counterinsurgency, and rising ethnic tensions, what would the post-conflict landscape look like? Could any resolution reconcile the competing nationalisms? Or had the island already crossed a threshold from which it could never return? And as British troops patrolled the roads and villages whispered with fear and defiance, the first moves toward an even more enduring and tragic separation were quietly and inexorably taking shape.
By the early 1960s, Cyprus was no longer merely a colony struggling under nationalist insurgency. It had become a society teetering on the edge of permanent division. The British strategy of divide and rule, implemented to maintain control during EOKA's campaign, had left indelible marks on the social and political fabric of the island. What was originally a struggle between Greek Cypriots and the British colonial administration had evolved into a bitter intercommunal conflict that pitted neighbor against neighbor, village against village, and brother against brother. As EOKA intensified its attacks, the Turkish Cypriot community responded in kind. Alarmed by the growing strength of Greek Cypriot nationalism and the possibility of a gnosis, Turkish Cypriots began organizing themselves into defense groups. The Turkish Resistance Organization, TMT, was established. Committed to protecting Turkish Cypriot communities and advocating for taxium, the partition of the island rather than unification with Greece. The dynamic was now clear. Cyprus was not just an anti-colonial battlefield. It was an island divided along ethnic lines, where two nationalist movements, once coexisting within the same society, were poised for confrontation. The British administration, recognizing the potential for civil war, attempted to negotiate between the factions while simultaneously maintaining a security presence. Yet every policy, every intervention, often backfired. Measures intended to curb violence, military patrols, curfews, checkpoints frequently exacerbated mistrust. Greek Cypriots viewed Turkish Cypriot militias as collaborators, while Turkish Cypriots feared marginalization and retribution. Villages and towns became segregated, with Greek and Turkish communities increasingly confined to their own neighborhoods. Schools, marketplaces, and places of worship that had once fostered interaction were now arenas of caution and suspicion. Violence escalated quickly. Ambushes, bombings, and assassinations were not confined to British targets. Intercommunal clashes multiplied. Families who had lived side by side for generations found themselves at odds, forced to choose sides or flee their homes. Stories emerged of Turkish Cypriot families hiding in attics to escape Greek Cypriot attacks, and Greek Cypriot villages reinforcing doors and barricades against possible reprisal. Cyprus, an island known for its shared festivals, mixed marriages, and centuries of coexistence, was now divided by fear and mistrust.
International diplomacy became involved as well. Greece, Turkey, and the United Kingdom each had vested interests in the outcome, but their interventions often deepened local divisions. Greece supported the Greek Cypriot nationalist movement, emphasizing gnosis as a moral imperative, while Turkey increasingly framed itself as the protector of Turkish Cypriots, backing the TMT. The United Nations attempted mediation, proposing constitutional arrangements and ceasefires, but these efforts largely failed. Each temporary pause in violence was followed by renewed clashes, as grievances, suspicions, and ambitions remained unresolved.
By 1963, Cyprus had effectively split into separate spheres of influence. Greek Cypriots dominated the south, Turkish Cypriots concentrated in the north, and British bases remained as islands of imperial authority. Segregated schools, villages, and neighborhoods formalized a separation that had initially been tactical but had now become structural. Intercommunal violence continued sporadically, cementing mutual fear and mistrust. Political compromise seemed impossible. Each side feared that yielding would mean losing not only political leverage, but existential security.
The long-term consequences of this period were profound. British colonial strategies, intended to suppress an insurgency, inadvertently entrenched ethnic divisions that would endure for decades. Cypriots, both Greek and Turkish, had come to view their neighbors as rivals or threats rather than fellow citizens, making reconciliation increasingly difficult. What began as a struggle against foreign rule had evolved into a civil conflict, deeply intertwined with identity, nationalism, and the legacies of empire. Even today, the echoes of this era reverberate across Cyprus. The Green Line, separating the northern Turkish Cypriot-administered areas from the Greek Cypriot south, remains a stark reminder of the divisions born in this turbulent period. Peace efforts, reunification talks, and international negotiations continue to grapple with the legacies of British colonial rule, the nationalist movements, and the decisions made in the 1950s and 1960s. The story of Cyprus demonstrates how historical policies, particularly those of a colonial power, can set into motion cycles of mistrust, violence, and segregation that last far beyond the departure of the empire itself. The lessons are clear. Nationalist ambitions, when combined with external manipulation and repressive governance, can transform an ordinary political struggle into a lasting conflict that shapes generations. Cyprus's history is a testament to the fragile balance between aspiration and coexistence, showing how quickly communities can turn against each other when political opportunity, fear, and identity collide. And as the world continues to watch Cyprus today, it serves as a warning of the long shadows cast by colonialism, insurgency, and intercommunal division. The final question lingers. Could Cyprus ever heal from this division? Or are the legacies of the 1950s and 1960s too deeply embedded in the hearts and minds of its people? While peace remains possible, the journey requires understanding history in all its complexity. The triumphs, the betrayals, the ordinary human lives caught in extraordinary conflict.